Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first Wednesday webinar of this academic year. I'm Mila Tappan from the Finance Authority of Maine, and with me is Jessica Whittier. And so we are so glad that you are here with us today. Today, we're going to be talking about tools to help students build a list of schools and make informed financial decisions. It's that time of year when we know your students are planning to build their list of schools they're going to apply to for admission and therefore financial aid. And so we just wanted to share some of our thoughts as to steps they can take to be well informed and to make those decisions. This Wednesday webinar is specifically targeted at school counselors and access professionals, financial aid people. But if we do happen to have some parents or others with us, we welcome you. We're glad to have you with us. Just know that we go a little bit deeper into the weeds sometimes with these conversations as a result of having them be people who we work with regularly. As I mentioned a moment ago, this is a webinar, so you cannot turn on your camera, unfortunately, or you can't unmute yourself. But we would love to have you put any questions or concerns or comments in the chat. As I go through today, I'll stop periodically and ask Jess if we have questions. If she sees something that's really critical, she'll just jump right in and share it with us, okay? So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk about the path to making higher education more affordable or affording higher education. And we're going to share a variety of tools with you. The first tool that we're sharing with you is a new tool that we have put together, and here is the front page of this. And this is really what's going to be the focus of much of our conversation today. We're going to talk about each of the steps along this pathway. We're going to talk about savings, getting financially fit, having the chat, building a list of affordable schools, and comparing financial aid offers. So we're going to touch on each of those and go into a little bit more detail. But first, we're going to start by talking about the piecemeal approach. So when we talk about the piecemeal approach, we talk about it in the sense that if families can think about paying for college as a pie or this piecemeal approach, it makes paying for higher education so much more affordable. The idea behind it is that the more pieces that you have, the less reliance there is on any one particular source of funding for higher education. So like I said, I like to think about it as a pie. And when I have a pie, if I only have two pieces in that pie, those have to be really large pieces to make a complete pie. But if I have 5 or 6 or 7 slices of pie, none of those pieces need to be quite so large. And so therefore, it makes all of those pieces provide more options available to families. And that's what we're all about, is making sure that students and families have as many options available as possible. So today, we really think about these pieces consisting of financial aid. That's those need-based grants and scholarships. We think about merit scholarships that are offered by the colleges. We'll talk a little bit more about those today. Private scholarships, the ones that you offer through your high school or through other employers or private organizations. Savings, we're definitely going to talk about parent earnings, student earnings, tuition payment plans, tax credit, federal student loans, and then for some families, we find that the private loans or parent loans are also a piece of that puzzle. So we really just like to focus on the fact that we have multiple ways that families can pay for higher education. And again, the more options, the earlier they start thinking about it and the more options they have in place, the better the process is going to be for them and the easier it is going to be to pay for higher education. So first, we wanted to talk about savings. So no doubt about it, saving for higher education is a really big deal. Probably I don't have to convince any of you as to why this is so important. But the reality is, as you probably have experienced in seeing financial aid offers through the years, is that most schools do not meet full need. So even our lowest income students are finding that when they look at their financial aid offers, there's not enough to cover their bill, even if their family has no money to contribute. Schools in Maine have done a great job, our public schools in particular, of making sure that they have these programs that really help those low income students pay for their tuition fees, but they've still got to find a way to cover their room and board. And even the full direct loan won't do that. So we're finding that those students are definitely having a gap. And then we have our middle income families who think they might even be prepared, have been thinking about how they're going to pay for higher education. But then when they see what their EFC is, or their expected family contribution, and what's anticipated by the school based on the formula, the thinking that the family can pay this much, they're shocked by that. And that amount is so much higher than they ever anticipated. A lot of families that we talk to, we'll still maybe hear the comment, well, my child needs to do this on their own. I paid for college myself, and they need to do the same thing. And I just think it's really helpful to think about the fact that, higher education costs have gone up much higher than other expenses, and certainly much higher than earnings. To out myself, I was a junior in college at UMaine in 1987. And I remember very clearly, for whatever reason, that my tuition and fees, it was $750 a semester, so $1,500 a year. So could I work and earn enough to pay for all of my tuition and fees? Yes, I absolutely could. But now we're talking about that number being $10,000 or more, not to mention living expenses. So it's just not practical for most students to be able to pay for their education themselves. And the really good news is that savings has little to no impact on financial aid eligibility. And if you've been to many of our sessions, we harp on this. We know there's this concern with families that they think they're shooting themselves in the foot if they save, but that is just absolutely not the case. And I have a little bit of information in a moment that I'll share related to that. So what I just wanted people to get a sense of, and maybe you've done this for yourself, and I'm guessing that some of you are here in the capacity of not only a school counselor or access professional, or a financial aid person, but you yourself may have children of your own. And so maybe you've thought about what's that EFC going to look like. And so what I've done here is, first of all, that federal formula is available. It's publicly available. So there's no secrets as to what impacts the financial aid eligibility. The expected contribution for parents is made up of two pieces. One is there's a look at the family's income, and that's where some of the EFC comes from. And then the other thing is there's a look at assets. And then, if appropriate, there's some contribution from assets. And those two things together equal the parent contribution. Well, right out of the gate, one of the things I would want to note is that it is income that is really the driving factor when it comes to EFCs. And this example is meant to show that. So what I've done here is I've taken 4 different families, and they are identical in every way, except that their incomes vary. So we're talking about a family of 4, 1 child in college. And so we look at family A with a $60,000 income and go up in $15,000 increments to family B, C, and finally family D with $105,000 in income. We can see what happens to the EFC. The EFCs, when families' incomes are lower, usually feel pretty reasonable. Still $3,300 for a family making $60,000 might seem, incredibly unreasonable. But all things considered, it's much more in the reasonable realm than when you look at a family who's making $105,000. I can pretty much, unless they've been working in this field, have no idea that their EFC is going to be $15,000. And when they see that, they practically fall off their seat, because there's just no way, unless they've been really preparing ahead of time. And even then, it might not be possible to come up with that sort of money. Okay. So this is why we want families to be thinking about this earlier, so that they know this is coming. And we have a discussion internally at FAME as to, do we want to share this earlier? Might we scare some people? But the reality is, we've come to the conclusion that we think it's much better that people know this sooner and can plan for it, than to get this shock senior year, and just it undermines everything that they've been working towards. So knowledge is power, right? So knowing this sooner rather than later, we think, is a good thing. Okay, so you can kind of get a sense with those incomes what the EFC would look like. Well, now I want to show you what happens if a family is able to save. So same scenario, I've taken the family with the $75,000 earnings. And so their contribution from income is a little over $6,100. Okay, so that contribution from income is the same because their income is the same. But what I've done is, in one case, they have no savings. In another, they have $10,000 of college savings, $25,000 here and $50,000 here. And I said college savings, but it could be any type of savings. Look at the increase in the EFC as a result of having savings. Obviously, no savings, no impact, but $10,000 of savings only increases the EFC by $240. $25,000 only increases it by $852. And $50,000 in savings only increases the EFC by about $1,900. In reality, that probably is going to have very little, if any, impact on their financial aid eligibility. Maybe a touch, but they've got $50,000 in savings, which is going to give them so many more options and make schools that otherwise might not have been affordable are all of a sudden going to seem affordable or be affordable for them. So that's one of the reasons why we want families to save, is that it gives them more options, and it does so without undermining their financial aid eligibility in the vast majority of cases. Now, if anyone's interested in seeing what their EFC would be, or working with families to see what their EFC would be ahead of time, Jess is not only monitoring comments, but what she's doing is she's putting some links in the chat. And so she's going to put in a link to the College Board Big Future site, and they have calculators and tools there. And one of their calculators and tools is an EFC calculator. So you can check that out and you can put in your information. And what I love is families can try different scenarios. They can try putting in savings or taking out savings and be convinced that it's really not going to have that negative impact on their financial aid eligibility. So there are a variety of college savings vehicles. Saving for College, I didn't put this in the links, Jess, but Saving for College is someplace that people can go and they can learn about all sorts of different savings options. But 529s, we're going to talk about a little bit more in a moment. And they are one way in which families save for college. But some do it with CoverDells or savings bonds or Roth IRAs or taxable savings accounts, just a regular bank account. Trusts, which we don't recommend because those tend to negatively impact financial aid eligibility more. So there are a whole variety of options. But what we want families to know is that ideally you want to save in the parent's name. Saving in the parent's name has much less impact on financial aid eligibility if you have that option. Saving in the student's name, the assumption is that if it's student savings, the student is the beneficiary of that education. So it does expect that more of a student's savings would be available to help pay for college. So if given the choice, and we're going to talk about how 529s work in a moment with this piece, you want to save in the parent's name where possible. So I just want to talk a little bit about NextGen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish up this section, the savings section, and then I'll break for questions. So if you have questions about savings or anything to this point, please put them in the chat. No, I'll be stopping in a second. So NextGen is Maine's 529 plan. So a 529 plan, in case you've ever wondered, why are they called 529s? If you go to the IRS tax code, not that anyone would want to, but if you did and you look up section 529, it's where they talk about these plans. 529 plans are simply tax advantage plans that are one way that families can save for higher education. Generally speaking, or better to say overview or in a nutshell, how a 529 works is you put in after tax dollars. So, money that you've already paid taxes on. So a little bit different than a retirement plan. You put in after tax dollars, and hopefully those investments grow over a period of time. And here's what makes them special. As they grow and you have earnings as a result of these investments, you don't have to pay taxes on those earnings. You've already paid taxes on your contribution. You don't have to pay taxes on your earnings so long as you use it for qualified higher educationally related expenses. So that's why people like these. And in Maine, Maine's 529 is NextGen. So if you are interested in 529 plans, or you are working with families that are, what we really like about them is that they're super flexible. So they're super flexible in the sense that they can be used at a whole variety of institutions. So sometimes people have said to me, well, I don't know if I want to do this because what if my student doesn't want to go to school in Maine? That doesn't matter. These are not restricted to only Maine schools. These funds can be used at any in-state or out-of-state school as long as it's an eligible accredited post-secondary institution. Here's the way to find that out. Do they participate in the federal financial aid programs? Do they have students file a FAFSA? If the answer to that is yes, these funds can be used at those institutions. So that's at thousands of institutions across the United States, both public institutions and private institutions. So I'm in Bangor, so UMaine up the road, as well as Husson down in the other direction. eligible, but funds are eligible to be used there and not have any tax consequences. They can be used at 2-year schools, at 4-year schools, at graduate schools, and even for some training programs and certificates. So you need to investigate that piece a little bit more. But again, if they participate in the federal financial aid programs, you know that they are eligible locations where students can use their funds without tax consequences. I'm going to add another one, just because this surprises people sometimes. They can even be used outside of the US in some cases. So here in Maine, we have a lot of students who go to school in Canada, Dalhousie, McGill, St. Francis Xavier. Those are all schools that participate in the federal financial aid programs, so the funds can even be used there. So lots of flexibility as to where the funds can be used. Additionally, lots of flexibility as to what the funds can be used for. So probably not surprising that the funds can be used for tuition and fees. That's probably a given, as well as books and supplies. And but what sometimes people don't realize is it can also be used things for like computer equipment and software and services. So it can be for a student to go ahead and purchase a computer, even if it isn't that their program requires one. Even if a student just needs a computer, because to go to college these days, let's be real, you pretty much need to have a computer. So students can purchase that computer and use their next gen funds or 529 funds to cover that expense. They can also use those funds for software and for services. So most students, you got to have your internet in order to have your computer work and do what you need to do. So the payment to Spectrum or whoever might be the internet provider is also an allowable expense within using next gen funds or 529 funds. Required equipment, imagine the student who's going to Eastern Maine Community College and they're going into the culinary arts program and they need to buy their knives and everything, all of that equipment. They can use these funds for those purchases as well. And even for room and board, as long as they're enrolled at least half time. So they can use these funds for room and board expenses, whether they're on campus or off campus. So on campus probably isn't as surprising, but students can even use these funds to pay their rent, to buy their food at the grocery store. I mean, there have to be within allowable limits, but that's how flexible those funds are. So that's one of the reasons why we really like 529s, is because of the flexibility in the use of those funds. I could do a whole presentation on next gen, but I'm not going to, but I just want to share just a couple more things about next gen, because we find, Jess and I find, and the others that work together, we find that we have seniors in high school and their families are like, how come we never knew about this? They've lived in Maine. This program's been around for 20 years and still they don't know about it. They haven't heard about it. So we like to talk about it every chance we get. And one of the super cool things about NextGen for Maine residents specifically is that we have grants available to make it a little bit easier to save for higher education. So again, not going to go into the weeds on this, but we have an initial matching grant. So if people open up an account with $25, they can get a $100 initial matching grant. If people set up automated funding, because we know that's the key to making regular contributions, once they've made 6 automatic contributions from a checking account, savings account, or payroll deduction, they get an automatic $100 grant. If they make contributions regularly throughout the year, every year on an annual basis, they are potentially eligible for a 30% match. So that first $1,000 that they put in can be matched for a maximum grant of $300. Okay, so families can put in as much as they want to put in, but the first $1,000 is matched at 30%, meaning if families can find a way to put in $1,000 per year, they are going to get a matching grant of $300. And that's been each and every year for multiple years. And we believe that's going to continue. So I just wanted to share briefly that we have these great grants. Reach out to me or any of us at FAME and we can talk more about it. But we just want to be sure there's an awareness that these grants exist. And these grants are for people who are either the owner is a Maine resident or the beneficiary is a Maine resident. It doesn't even have to be both of them. Now, when I talked about saving in a parent's name being the ideal way for families to save, one of the other benefits of a NextGen account is it's always considered a parent asset. So even though the beneficiary might be the student, is the student in many cases, the way that it is looked at by federal regulation is it's considered a parent asset, so has the minimal effect on financial aid eligibility. So we're really excited about savings. We think it's super important. We love it when people start early, ideally when the kids are very young, but the reality is it's never too late. And even seniors in high school can open up these funds, even college students. And for a matter of fact, my youngest is still in school and we still contribute to that next gen account to get that matching grant. So early is better, but it's never too late. Jess, do we have any questions that I should be thinking about before we continue on?
So just one question, and I put up a link, but the question was how to know which schools, which international colleges accept federal financial aid or work with the FAFSA and will, where next gen funds can be used. I did put up the link to the studentaid.gov spreadsheet.
Oh, good. Okay.
Is that the only? I'm trying to think if there's a college search option on their site, or is it just the spreadsheet?
Yeah, I think it's just when you're in the FAFSA, you can do the search. And if it comes up, if the school comes up, you will know that they're eligible. If you were within the FAFSA and you were doing that search, what you'd want to do is you can look it up by state. But if you go FC for foreign country, that's where you can see a list of all of the eligible institutions that are outside of the US. But you've done exactly what I would do, Justin. I will make a note to share that spreadsheet. Okay, so I always send out an email after we do this. So probably Thursday or Friday, I will send you an email with any follow-up questions that I didn't get a chance to answer, and any other resources that we haven't shared that we think are important. So I'll make sure I send that, so you not only have it in the link, but you'll have it in an email to refer back to later. So perfect, Jess, that was great. Anything more?
That was it.
Okay, all righty. So then the next step is to get financially fit. And this one's a little bit tougher. We always think it's good to get financially fit. The Finance Authority of Maine, financial education is one of the things that we focus on a lot, including as employees. We have the opportunity, we're so fortunate that we meet with a financial counselor on a regular basis as employees. So we talk a lot. Jess and I think we both had our meeting within the last week. So we had to kind of figure out where things stand with us. But it's really good, but it's easy to avoid and it's easy to not think about. But what we want people to know is that if they can get financially fit, again, it just provides them with more options. So if families, let's say when students are in middle school, or even early high school, always good to be financially fit. But at that point in time, you can really start to focus on the family's financial fitness. That really makes it a lot easier. So what are some of the things that people can do? One is to start paying off debt. So, if credit card debt has been racked up or other types of debt, it's a great time to say, okay, can we make a plan to start paying this down in the hopes that by the time our kids are in college, maybe we won't have that expense anymore. Reducing additional expenses, existing expenses. So, I am guilty right now. I thought about this the other day. I have Netflix, I have Prime, I had Showtime. I have got to clean up this stuff because I am spending money on things that I don't need to be anymore. But sometimes, especially when you do the set it and forget it, which is why we like it with Next Gen, right? But when we do it with our own stuff, sometimes we just have it be a habit and we don't, it comes out automatically. And so to take effort to change it is something we don't do. So to take a look at those things can be really beneficial and result in some savings. To resist the urge to take on new expenses. Literally, Jess and I have heard people say, should we go buy that boat we wanted the senior year of high school? Because we don't want to have money in our savings because that's going to mess up our financial aid eligibility. So we think we're going to go buy a new boat. Yeah, we might have a payment on it, but we can cover a lot of it with our savings. We literally have heard these things, you guys. This is not what we want people to do. Do not take on that additional debt when it is time to go to college, or time for your student to go to college, because the FAFSA doesn't take into account your debt. So it is going to work against you, but again, the savings is not going to in the same way. So all of this is meant to free up money in the budget, to contribute more to that college savings. That's one piece of it, but also to make money available for a tuition payment plan once your student is in college. So it can be a little bit of both. So, it might be that while your student is in high school, you're trying to make more money available so that you can save. And then once they're in college, maybe you've got even a little bit more. So you can continue saving some to get those next gen grants. But then you've also got money for a tuition payment plan. In tuition payment plans, we're not looking at using them to pay the remaining balance, just as one piece of that pie that has multiple pieces. But what happens a lot, heck, I've been guilty of this, is that we put our heads in the sand. Families put their head in the sand. They just, get busy with life and they think, I just can't deal with this right now. But if people can, the earlier they can, the better off they're going to be, because sometimes they can make even just little tweaks that are going to provide them with more options. Where if they don't think about this, they're going to get to the point that it's going to be senior year and they feel like they're in over their head and they don't have a lot of options available to them. The next piece, and I'll take a break after this one, Jess, is to have that chat. So some interesting thoughts here related to having that chat in this conversation. So in a 2017 study, 69% of parents said that they are reluctant to discuss finances with their kids. Parents are nearly as uncomfortable talking to their kids about money as they are about sex. So documented research has demonstrated that. But here's another piece to keep in mind, is that 53% of students believe that discussing paying for college with their parents earlier would have decreased the amount that they borrowed. So even though these conversations can be challenging, they are so incredibly important. Now, I don't think that that means you have to go into great detail, or your families need to go into great detail about, how much money people make and all of that. My oldest son, Alex, is 26. And when he was in high school, I used to travel a lot more than I do these days. And so we would just have these conversations because he'd come to financial aid nights with me. And what we ended up doing with him is, before senior year, saying to him, this is how much dad and I can contribute. Okay. So we actually gave him a dollar amount. We didn't talk about all these other details, but we said, this is about how much dad and I can come up with. And that really laid that important groundwork and set expectations so that when senior year rolled around and he started getting those financial aid offers, he had a good sense of what as a family we could contribute. And then the conversation went from there. And I'll be honest, there were some schools right out of the gate where it was clear they weren't going to work for him. And that was just the way that it was. But it was a lot easier because we'd had those conversations leading up to it, which just made it a little bit easier. So there's a whole bunch of conversation starters that I think are great and important if you can do them, or your families can do them, again, depending on whether you are in a dual role as a parent and a professional here today. These are some of the things that we think are great to talk about. This is on the back of that tool. So it's everything from, who is saving and how much is being saving? What's the expectation for your kids? Is the expectation that when they get money for birthdays or holidays, they're going to save some of it for college or not? If that conversation doesn't take place, I found with my kids, sometimes it just didn't happen. So I had to have that conversation and lay out those expectations. They could not read my mind, just like my husband, apparently still, after almost 30 years, cannot read my mind. So having those conversations is so incredibly important. Is a tuition payment plan going to be an option? Is that the goal that families are working towards? What's the expectation around scholarships? Do you expect the students to apply? If so, for how many scholarships? How much time are they going to commit to that? What about grades? We all know that grades do make a difference. Grades can have a huge impact on students' financial aid in terms of merit aid. So what is the expectation there? And then around borrowing, how much are people feeling comfortable with? Are students going to borrow it all? Are parents going to borrow any? Who's going to repay those loans? And then I think this is a big one. What happens if that student gets into a school that's unaffordable? Are you still going to make it happen? Are you going to do whatever it takes? You as a parent or the parents that you're working with, I hear that all the time. We're going to do whatever it takes. And oftentimes those same parents come back years later and said, what the heck did we do? We borrowed so much more than we ever should have. So just having that conversation early can avoid, because things get really emotional. You go no better than I do. Senior year, things get super emotional and people kind of lose all sense of, what they might logically decide earlier, which is why laying the groundwork earlier is so important. And then last big category is we just like to have a conversation about pathways. So if a school isn't affordable, are there other pathways? Maybe going to a different school for a year or two, maybe going to, the local university, maybe going to community college, maybe living at home. There are all sorts of ways that students can meet their goals. And so having that conversation and figuring out what options are on the table and which options are not on the table. So those are just a few of the conversation starters that we think are great to have. There are many more, and some may not be for everyone, but those are a good place to start, we think. Jess, do we have any questions?
So no questions, but just a few thoughts. Just in my, my travels and listening to a lot of school counselors do their presentations to seniors. I think I hear more often this idea, to maybe try to save the conversations to, limit it to 1 day a week so that students aren't, bombarded with talk about college all the time. But it's hard to know what to have in those conversations. So I do think that list of conversation starters is really a great place when it comes to money. And then the other piece I feel I hear a lot is, that the parents are just going to take care of it. I'm just going to take care of this for them. And the reality is, at the end of the day, if they're taking out any student loans, this is their debt. So you taking care of it you may feel, or these parents might feel like they're doing something great, but those are going to be the students on the back end who just don't understand how they got there, right? So it's, again, having those conversations early. Okay, we have a couple of comments that just rolled in, so let's take
Okay.
All right. So one question is, do families decide to divert retirement savings payments, or the amount contributed during the year, towards paying for college, or should they?
Well, so I'm not going to give a direct answer to that question because I am not.
We are not financial advisors.
I would say that my financial advisor would say no. Not that I have a real serious financial advisor, but a person that we do talk with about these things. There are varying opinions about this. There is one thing that you do hear a lot, which is you can't borrow for retirement, you can for college. And I will say I've got an older mom at the moment. And, I do think we want to be awfully careful that we make sure we have what we need for retirement. So, but that is a conversation to have with someone who has a much better understanding of your full financial situation. Clearly, if someone was in really good shape in terms of their retirement, maybe they could afford to. I just don't know. But I think it's something you'd want to talk with someone about and look at your financial situation, or the family that you're working with wants to look at their financial situation comprehensively.
So a couple more. So I think one of them we're going to address in just a minute, but and another one about a family that makes too much money and they're not eligible for financial aid, but can't afford that. The family contribution. What do they do?
Okay, great. We do have something coming up where, and this is going to get right to building that list of affordable schools. So,
right.
So I'll go ahead and move on, Jess, if that's
perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So we are going to talk about that piece because we run into a lot of families. We tend to work with a lot of lower income families, but we also work with a lot of middle income families. So we kind of see it from both of those perspectives. So what we want students and families to do is to really research the schools from a financial aid perspective. You're working with them and they're probably learning ways to research schools based on academic programs, size of institutions. Some people feel very strongly about public versus private. You're really looking at all of those things so that they can go to college and be successful, which is incredibly important. But we just want to add to that, not in place of that. This should not be the sole decision maker. But we just want to add researching schools from that financial aid perspective. Because as you've probably seen through the years and working with many, many students, is that schools vary dramatically in the amount and types of aid that they can offer. So you probably had that student come in with multiple financial aid offers that are all over the place. And so we want to give families a little bit of insight as to how they can know about which schools have, maybe a little bit better aid or maybe not as great of aid early on in the process. So when we think about aid, and this is a given for all of you, is there really are two types of financial aid that we're talking about. There's merit-based aid, and merit-based aid is the aid that's based on who the student is, having nothing to do with the family's resources. So merit aid is typically awarded by the admissions office based on maybe the student's academics or test scores, or maybe it's by the department within a college. The engineering department has some merit-based scholarships for them. A handful of kids, never as many as they think out there, but maybe the student is eligible for an athletic scholarship. That falls into the category of a merit-based scholarship. So these types of scholarships are great, especially for middle income families, because they aren't based on financial need. I'm going to talk in a minute about how you can try to get the handle on which schools offer these. That is not as easy as I wish it was, okay? But merit-based aid is fabulous, but not all schools offer merit aid, so we'll get to that. Then need-based aid is the aid that's offered based on filling out the FAFSA or the CSS profile. So that is almost exclusively based on the family's finances, right? Family income, a little bit about family assets, number of people in the family, and things like that, without looking at how strong the student might be academically. So for families to understand these two types of aid are very different types of aid, awarded differently, awarded from different departments, is a really important place for families to start. So let me focus on need-based aid for a moment. So how is financial need calculated? At the end of the day, it's a really simple formula that every school out there uses. They take their cost of attendance, tuition fees, room, board, book, supplies, all of that, and they come up with a number. And so here we've got a low-cost school at $9,600, a mid-cost school like probably our public institutions of about $24,500, maybe a little less. And then we've got schools that are very expensive. $62,000, for example, is actually low. We know there are schools out there costing over $70,000 per year. The EFC is the same, regardless of which school the student's applying to, right? So the amount of need that a student has at each school is going to vary. So this is one of the reasons why we say everybody should file a FAFSA, because we can't tell you if you're going to be eligible for financial aid based on your income, because it's not just your income, it's which school are you going to and how expensive is that school. So a family might not be eligible for much aid at a low-cost school, but might be eligible for a decent amount of aid at a high-cost school, okay? Now, if we lived in a perfect world, which we certainly know we do not, but if we lived in a perfect world, in every one of these schools met 100% of that need. So low-cost school gave them $3,600, mid-cost gave them $18,500, high-cost gave them $56,000. The student could then make their decision about where they wanted to go without regard as much to the financial aid piece of it, right? Because they're all filling 100% of that need and keeping them on level ground when it comes to financial aid. But that's not the reality. So we want families to research this percent of need met so that they can get a sense of whether the schools the student is looking at are pretty good schools when it comes to financial aid eligibility or schools that really struggle. Now, I'm not meaning to be negative about schools that struggle to meet a high percentage of need. It's just the reality. Schools that have been around for a long time, that have had time to build their endowments, have more money. Schools that are newer or public institutions just sometimes don't have the money. They are not any happier about it than the families are, and they wish they had more. But just knowing the reality of who does and who doesn't can be helpful. The other big piece, and I know you guys have seen this, is that we want families to focus on net price, not sticker price. And what I mean by that is net price is the cost of that school minus their grants and scholarships, right? So if you do that for every school, net price, cost of the attendance minus grants and scholarships, then that's what the school really costs. Sometimes students will get really freaked out, understandably so, when they see that a school costs $75,000, or maybe it's their parents that get more freaked out. But here's the thing, the schools that are really, really expensive, some of those schools, not all, but some of those schools are the schools that have the best financial aid. So we have all seen situations where some students can go to a very expensive private school for less than they can go to their state university. And what the key is to understand there, it's because we have to focus on net price, cost minus grants and scholarships, which are the funds that don't have to be repaid. So where can we learn a little bit more about these two things so that students can build that list of schools that are really going to work for them? So I love this site. I don't love the College Board all the time, but I do love their Big Future portion of their website. So if you go there, and if you haven't been there recently, they did a revamp of it over the summer. So if it looks different than you remember it, and that happened to us too. One day I just went and I'm like, oh my, this is different than I remember it. So the way that it's structured now is the student first goes to this website and they want to search on one of these 4 criteria. So location, major, type, or campus life. So major is probably going to be where a lot of students start. So the student clicks on major, then they can put in what major they're interested in. And so here, my friend Nikki did this, and she looked up environmental science. So out of the 4,000 almost schools that are in the database, it funneled it down to about 606 schools that offer a major in environmental science. Now you're going to see some additional options that you didn't see before. So if you look here, do you see where it says affordability? So if you click on the affordability tab here, then what's going to happen is it's going to bring up this window where you can go in and you can determine, you can filter schools. So filter in and filter out schools based on their financial need met. So what I might do, and this is, I remember when Alex wanted to transfer schools, I said to him, let's start by looking at schools that meet a certain percentage of need. So let's start by looking at schools that meet at least 90% of need, so that we have schools on our list that appear on average, that's key, but appear on average to have really good financial aid. Okay. So that is one of those things that we would love for everyone to do when they're building their list of schools. If they've got a school in mind, they can go directly to that school, and in their at a glance page, it will tell them down at the bottom what percent of need that school meets. Okay, on average, but still so important, because if you've got a school that your student is really interested in, and this happened with us, and it's only meeting 45% of need, you're in for a rough haul. Okay, so you want to have other options, or you want to know that you've got to have a lot of other sources beyond financial aid to be able to pay the rest of that bill. So then there's the net price calculator. So the net price calculator is that calculator that exists on the website for every school out there that participates in the federal financial aid programs, or it's supposed to be out there. Usually it's on the financial aid page. And what this tool does is it allows families to put in their specific information, their income, very similar to the questions that are going to be asked on the FAFSA, as well as the school is going to use their specific resources. So they're going to look at, okay, what do we have available for financial aid? And they're going to produce an estimate. So that estimate is going to give the family a sense of what the cost of that school is going to be for them specifically, okay? Because percent of need met is an average. Net price calculator allows them to get a little bit more specific and look at their financial situation at that particular school and what that financial aid offer might look like. Okay, so I love to have people check that out. Now, a few caveats about net price calculators. Please don't make a decision based on it. Okay, this is just one additional piece of information. We do not want students making a final decision based on net price calculator. It's just a tool to help them get in the ballpark of what a school might look like. Before net price calculators existed, students didn't have any idea of what schools might offer them until they got their financial aid offer, which might not have been until February, March, or April of their senior year. So net price calculators are just meant to be a tool to give them a little insight earlier. The other thing that net price calculators don't always include is merit aid. So this comes back to those families who are looking at not maybe getting a lot of financial aid and wondering what they should do. So here's one of the things I learned. And I learned this again when Alex was going through his senior year, is that I never knew this. I worked at UMaine. I didn't realize that some of the most prestigious schools didn't offer merit aid. Okay. So you think about your Bates, Bowdoin, Colby, Harvard, Yale, they do not do merit aid. They don't do any of it because their students are all meritorious. So all of their financial aid is need-based, which means if you are a very high income family and you have a very high EFC, even if your student is awesome and amazing, they're not going to get merit aid at some of these schools. But then there are the next tier down schools, those schools that are still really, really great schools. And they want your kids, right? They want those kids who could get into those prestigious schools. And one of the ways they attract those students is to say, hey, we've got merit aid, you've got this GPA, you've got these test scores, we want you to come to our school. And we're going to make it more affordable for you to do so because we're going to give you merit aid. Still probably not going to be eligible for a lot of need-based aid, but we are going to give you merit aid out of the admissions office or whatever based on your academics. So for those middle income families, you really, really want to be sure that they are talking with schools about merit aid. Do they have merit aid? How do they award their merit aid? How much merit aid do they have to offer? Because that for middle income families is really going to be, I think, the difference maker. Now, the challenge is it's hard to figure out which schools have merit aid. The best I've been able to come up with, and I hope eventually there'll just be a place you can go, but if you are on the College Board website and you are looking at a specific school and you look in the paying for college section, it does talk about merit aid, and it talks about how much merit aid they give out on average per student. And it talks about what the criteria is for awarding merit aid. So you can go and you can at least get a sense of, do they offer merit aid at all? And if they do, how does that compare to, on average, the amount of need-based aid that they're putting out there? So at least it's—
They call it non-need-based aid. They don't call it merit aid.
Exactly, non-need-based aid. Exactly. So I wish there was a little bit easier way to do that, but hopefully that will help those families look at that. So we certainly encourage students to apply to a multiple number of schools. Don't go crazy, because if they're selected for verification, it becomes a nightmare. But maybe 5, 6-ish. You guys have a better sense of that. But what we want to avoid is the student only applying to one school. You guys, we have seen students who apply to 1 or 2 schools. Maybe they're both out of state and they're completely unaffordable, and it's July and the parents and the student are freaking out. So we just want to be sure that the student has good options, and that ideally they don't get their heart set on any particular school, but instead they remain open to the fact that there are lots of great schools out there that can meet their need and help them achieve their goals. And we want all families to have a financial aid safety school, just like you have an academic safety school, the school that the student can get into. We want families to have that school that they really feel like, even if the financial aid isn't great, with federal student loans and a little bit of this and a little bit of that, they can still make it happen. Okay. So Jess, that's the end of that section. So do we have questions that we want to address before we take on that last section?
Yeah, so I think one good one to cover right now would be, talking about schools that use the CSS profile when talking about that EFC. So school institutions that are using their own methodology to determine their institutional aid versus the FAFSA.
Absolutely. So when we talk about schools that require a financial aid application, every school out there requires the FAFSA because the FAFSA is used to determine eligibility for federal financial aid, for state financial aid here in Maine, and for institutional financial aid at many schools. But schools that tend to be those same schools that are very prestigious and have a lot of financial aid available, they typically will also require the CSS profile. And they use the CSS profile to award their own institutional funds instead of the FAFSA. You might say, well, why do they do that? The reason they do that, and you guys actually wouldn't ask that question because you've seen the CSS profile and it asks additional questions that the FAFSA doesn't ask. So these schools that have a lot of their own money want to be sure that they're directing their money to the students who need it the most. So they want to know a little bit more. I think the two biggest, there are a variety of differences between the two forms. The two biggest is that the CSS profile is going to pick up those non-custodial parents that are not included on the FAFSA, and the CSS profile wants to know about home equity. So those are kind of the big two that we see as what would make the big difference. So when they award federal and state aid, they're going to use the FAFSA EFC, but when they award their own institutional aid, they are going to use the CSS profile or the institutional EFC, and those can be very different. There are some families who find the EFC from the profile is less than the FAFSA, so it can actually go either way. But at those schools, so when you see a school that requires the CSS profile, know that that's how they're going to award their need-based funds. Anything more on that, Jess, you would add?
Yeah. Well, and I would just say that those net price calculators are going to give you that picture, so at the end of the day, it's, using the net price calculator to get a better picture of that. Again, they're not always going to include merit aid, but at least the rest of it, that's in there. Other question, sorry, go ahead.
Can I just say real quick, the good way to know whether they're offering merit aid is if they don't ask you when you're doing the net price calculator about GPA or test scores, they are not building in merit aid. They can't, they don't have any way to do it if they don't know those things. So that's one way of kind of knowing which way they're going.
Yeah, they don't have it standardized.
Yeah, doesn't mean they don't have merit aid, but they're not putting it in the net price calculator.
And then one question about any ideas about how to dispel the idea of athletic scholarships. So this, students are, so many students leaning on that as maybe their way they're going to college. What
we should do, maybe just we can do this. We need to find, I have seen it. It exists out there. There is a statistic that says what percentage of students, and they did a great campaign on the news, not on the news, but on the TV. I've seen some campaigns about this, that, most students don't get an athletic scholarship. But maybe we can find some stats about that and do a great meme or something, or, some image that shares that stat, because you're absolutely correct. More students think that they're going to than are ever going to be eligible. So yeah, let's see if we can find a fun way of sharing that information with students.
Great.
Okay, so it is about 10 of 1:49 to be honest. So this is our last section. And this is some of this is going to be information that you already know that we talk about in other sessions. But I think this is where sometimes parents don't do what we ask them to do and students don't do what we ask them to. They might even have that broad list of schools that they apply to. They go through the process, they apply, and they get their financial aid offers. But the minute the student gets admitted to that school that they really want to go to, that's it, they're done. They don't ever look at what the costs are going to be. So we want to be sure that that happens. So we would love to have every single family out there do that apples to apples comparison of their financial aid offers before that final decision gets made, even if they're leaning in one direction. Because I think Jess and I would both say that after spending our whole professional careers working in this general area, I can't look at a financial aid offer or 5 or 6 financial aid offers and right off the bat tell you which school is the most affordable, because every financial aid offer looks different. Every school costs a different amount. Different pieces of information are included. So we really got to find a better way to do that. And the way that we think is a better way to compare these offers is using our tool, our comparing costs and financial aid offers tool, because what that is going to do is walk families through, here's what the costs are, here are what the direct costs are, minus out the grants and scholarships, right? That money that doesn't have to be repaid. What does that get you again? Get you your net price. And you can look at that net price for one school to the next school to the next school. And that really gives that clear picture of which school is going to be more affordable than another. Now, again, I'm not saying that students need to pick the least expensive school. We want students to go to a school where they are going to be able to be successful and to graduate. That's the big key. But at the same time, cost has got to come into play somewhere. And we just have too many students who are picking a school that financially is just, really, to be honest, sometimes not, just doesn't make sense, right? So this is a tool that can really help with that, we believe. If they are going to borrow, they're going to subtract out their federal student loans too. It's going to be the same. Their federal student loan is going to be the same at all schools. $5,500 currently for first year students. So even after they subtract that out, it isn't going to change, where the one school versus the other school. They're still going to come down to a similar bottom line. And I think another really important thing here is that families ideally will think about the fact that this is for multiple years. So again, we have seen so many families who can make it work that first year. They've got some savings, they've got this in place and that in place. But then what happens sophomore year? And what happens once the student's gone to the school of their dreams, they've gotten attached, they really love it, and then the next year they can't afford to go back. So to really, before that commitment is made, to think about, okay, can we do this for 2 or 4 or more years, whatever it's going to be, is really an important part, again, of the conversation. And so much of this comes back to conversation. So just to reiterate here, some things we talked about early about this piecemeal approach, it's not just the financial aid offer. That is a piece of it. But when they're making those decisions, every family is different, but we want them to think about scholarships. We want them to think about their savings. We want them to think about how manageable those tuition plans are. And again, if they started thinking about this years before, greater likelihood that this is a piece that can work. Private loans, plus loans, but also educational tax credits and deductions. So, a lot of times families will see that the next year their tax bill is going to be a little bit less because they help pay for some of their students' schooling. Well, if they can take that additional tax money and they can turn around and use it for the next semester's tuition, again, that's one more piece of this pie that makes everything a little bit more affordable. And of course, these are the other things that we know you're talking with them about, is that we need to think about the return on investment, especially if loans are needed. I'm going to be honest, all the years I worked at Orono, I worked at Orono for 16 years, I did not give sufficient weight to that consideration. So, when I was talking with students, I might have thought, okay, he's going to be an engineer, this person's going to be a social worker, but I wouldn't have never done the math with them. I didn't stop and think about, okay, well, what that means is, I knew that engineers were going to have an easier time paying back their student loans than the social workers, but we really need to give a lot more thought to that. How much are they paying to get this education? And what is that education going to result in when they leave and they get a job? How much is it going to pay? And what's that ratio? What's acceptable? So we need people to be teachers and educators like you are, but hopefully those people are not going to go to schools where they're going to go deeply into debt because they're not going to have the same ability to repay those loans. So we just want that to be a part of the conversation. Are there jobs going to be available? At the moment we have a ton of jobs available out there, although they might not be in every single field. So looking at that is important. getting down to the brass tacks of how much is the student going to make? Is the student going to make 30,000 out of school their first year, or are they going to make 70,000? That has a huge impact on how much they can afford to borrow. And yet another tool we have is our student loan salary calculator. And this is a really cool tool. Again, just a tool, just a piece of information where students can put in what they think their salary is going to be when they get out of school, and it will calculate what is a reasonable amount of student loan debt. Because the amount of reasonableness varies depending on whether they're going to be earning 35,000 or 70,000. And this calculator will do it for them. And I think anytime there's a tool that feels a little less emotional, that can be a good thing to add into the equation when parents and students or whoever is having the conversation with these students. So if you could check that out or share that with families, we think that would be a really good thing to do. We do have resources. So we have, just a whole bunch. Our tools and calculators page is where you're going to find many of them, but we obviously have information on filing the FAFSA. October 1st is coming. We have lots of great informational videos. We'd love to have you check those out. Some of them touch on some of these sorts of topics. So that would be great if you could share those with students. And of course, we are going to have our financial aid information sessions. We're doing those now. We had one last night. We have another one next week and then the following week. So please share those with your families. And then we will have FAFSA help sessions. So next week, you will get information about those FAFSA help sessions. We have the save the dates out there already. You're going to get an email, many of you, at 2:00 today with the dates of those sessions, but registration information will be available no later than next week as well. And then last, before I see if we have any remaining question or Jess has any additional thoughts to share, what we really just want families and students to do is to create as many options as possible, not to box themselves in. Options are a good thing. And to recognize that there are multiple pathways. Again, I keep bringing up my son, but I just think that, this has really, this has informed my thinking on this. And, he didn't go to his dream school his first year. We just couldn't afford it. We were not going to go into the amount of debt we would need to. And so he went to a different school for a year, and then he transferred to his school that he really wanted to go to. And it all worked out. My youngest son has been living at home while he's been going to school. For him, that works, and it's much less expensive for us. And that was his choice, not ours specifically. But my point being is that what you envision, or what the parents envision, or the student envisions as the dream and the only pathway, is not the only pathway. So to see multiple options are really important. And that for families, they've got multiple kids. It's about more than just that first one. How are they going to get their multiple kids? Jess has 4 through school, and lots of things to consider. And that really comes back to, we want college to be a great experience. Goodness knows it's been kind of upended the last year or two. But, when students are going to college, to still recognize that is a very short period in their lives. So to go deeply into debt for 4 years of a great time, we see students who live better in college than they do once they graduate. We want to flip that around. While you're in college, we all did it, right? You live on the cheap. You maybe don't make the best food decisions, eat a lot of ramen noodles, but making those sacrifices, having those additional roommates, or living in a place that doesn't have all the extras. If students can do that and can borrow less money, then when they graduate, they're going to have potentially additional options available to them as to what job they take, where they want to work, where they're going to live, and all of those other, things that follow. So I will let that be the closing thought there. Jess, what would you like to share in our last couple of minutes?
So I've got one more coming in. I'll look at it in a second. But so one of the other, another comment from a school counselor was, the number of families out there hoping, upper middle income families hoping to send their kids out of state to public institutions, really being shocked by the fact that, they think they're prepared. They think they've saved, right? But, when they're put in a position to need to take out $25,000 to $30,000 a year in student loan debt in order to make that possible, it becomes a whole lot harder.
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with a mom this morning, and her daughter was looking at an out-of-state public. Those are the hardest to fund because the out-of-state publics, you don't get the tuition discount. And because they're publics, they don't tend to have enough financial aid to meet everyone's full need. So yes, we find that those tend to be the most challenging financially for families. So that's why having that mix of schools, that's why doing that price calculator early is helpful because they're often not prepared for that difference between publics and privates out of state.
And then we've just got one more. Can you read the one from Mike and sorry, from Ron, sorry. Sorry, Ron. I'm getting lost in your comment.
Hold on a second. Oh, I love you, Ron. Yeah, so Ron's basic comment is, wish we could also include mention and consideration for another piece or section of the pie related to SES, social economic outcomes, and social and motivational considerations, and about fit and success, sort of the ready, willing, and able piece. And, you know, so I don't know, Ron, if I'm going to hit on what you're thinking, but, you know, I think the piece about how I am interpreting that is we need to have students go somewhere where they're going to be motivated, where they ideally want to be, and where they're going to be successful. We want them to go to schools that have the support services that they need. Some students will never need to go to a tutoring session or the writing center. Other students will not get through if they don't, and they need to have that as an option. And more schools do recognize all of that and have those supports in place. So, you know, I think that might be what you're getting at. If I haven't hit the nail on the head, I apologize. But yeah, it's complicated, right? Like everything in life, it's complicated. And we're adding more to these conversations rather than making them more straightforward. I acknowledge that, but that's by starting early, like Jess said, pick a day of the week. My favorite time to have conversations with my kids is always in the car, the tough ones. And you know, take a ride once a week and talk about these things or something like that. And starting early, I just think will make all of these things a little bit easier.
And I love that I just got an email from a school counselor, you know who you are, while we were talking about this, saying, hey, should I invite underclassmen to the financial aid night? Like, yeah, that would be great. Yeah. And if you can get me in at your middle school, that's even better.
Yeah, we were thrilled when the FAFSA became available in October, because it meant we had to push FA nights back to the spring of junior year, because we had wanted to do that for years. And it was just really hard to get that momentum to make that happen. And by virtue of the FAFSA being available in October, you know, that has been the case, you know, when we were in normal times, at least largely. But yeah, we'd welcome them anytime. I mean, we would love to have families start thinking about this as early as possible. A lot to take in, whole new language, a little bit at a time makes it easier.
Yeah, whatever we can do so they are not overwhelmed in senior year by some of the numbers that they're seeing. Because I do feel we get this all or nothing, right? Sometimes, and too many choosing the nothing. So if we can get those numbers more comfortable and a plan in place that is affordable for families, that they understand that path, you know, that's going to make a big difference.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We are just a little after 2, so we're going to end here, but we're available. So Jess and I are available, the whole cafe team, Nikki, Maria, Florica, we're all available to have these conversations with families and share these things. And so we really appreciate you sharing this information with them, and let us know what we can do. If you want us to do this presentation at your school, and at the moment it would be virtually, but if, you know, with your underclass students and families, we're there. We want to talk about this sooner. So let us know how we can help. So you guys have a great day. I'll be sending an email follow-up, and I hope you have a good one. And thanks, Jess, for being here as well.
Thanks, Val.